Started again, so we're going to ask folks to turn their attention so that Maria can introduce Dina. So we're really fortunate to have today Dina Gilio-Whitaker from the Colville Confederated Tribes join us as our lunchtime keynote. Dina is a lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and her research focuses on Indigenous nationalism, self-determination, environmental justice, and education. One of the things that brought her to our attention is her recent book, As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice, From Colonization to Standing Rock, and we included a chapter from that book in your readings today. So I think without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dina, and let's first test and make sure everyone can hear you.
Okay, how's that? Can you hear me okay?
Needs to be louder.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we're going to work on boosting it a little more.
Okay, I've got it.
Oh, wow.
Is that better?
Better? Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I've got my headset and I'll hold the mic close. Okay, are we ready to go?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, why Pisnuxio Ku E Squeezed Dina Gilio-Whitaker, and I'm coming to you from the ancestral but unceded homelands of the Ohashiman Nation here in Orange County in Southern California. So just to begin with a quick land acknowledgement, and to acknowledge the land that you're on right now. I'm not really sure, but I'm thinking it's the Cheyenne, land of the Cheyenne, and maybe you can correct me about that. So to acknowledge both the ancestry of both places. So what I want to do is I've got a PowerPoint prepared for you, and I'm going to share my screen. And I think what's going to happen when I share the screen is that I'm going to go away and all you'll see is the PowerPoint, but I'll switch back after we do that. So give me just a minute here to do this. Okay, let's see. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yep, yes.
Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and share full screen here in presentation mode. Okay.
We can still see you too, Dina.
Oh, you can? Oh, great. I did this. This is actually the second keynote I've done this week over video. And so the last time I did it a few days ago, we didn't get the screen with the PowerPoint. So I don't know what that was, but this is better. Okay, so the topic of my talk today is decolonizing environmental justice. And so I'm going to give you pretty much of an overview of what this work that I'm doing is about. And it's going to be divided into two parts. It'll be sort of the foundational theoretical work about it. And then the second part will be more kind of activist oriented, more praxis, hands-on, and I'll share with you some of my experience about how that's showing up for me in my work. Because as I understand it, you've got a pretty diverse crowd there, people who are doing activist work, but also doing scholarship. So the goal is to make this really applicable in as many ways as possible. Okay. Okay, so is everything visible on your screen there? You don't have any, like in my view, I've got some blocking out here.
We can see everything.
Okay, perfect. So I just a quick background about me is that was it Maria that introduced me?
Yeah.
So yes, I'm a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes in Washington State, but I live in Southern California where I was born and raised. I'm a lecturer of American Indian Studies at Cal State San Marcos. I'm also a journalist. I've been a journalist in the Native media for the last 9 or 10 years or so, on American Indian issues and scholarship. So I've done a lot of writing, and I'm also an independent consultant. So I do a lot of work with outside organizations on different kinds of projects, especially related to environmental justice. And I have 2 books out. The first book is All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans, which I was fortunate to co-author with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who of course wrote An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. And then the second book came out on earlier this year on environmental justice, which is the basis of this talk. Okay, so let's talk about what environmental justice is. So what do we mean when we say environmental justice? The theoretical and conceptual foundation for this is that we see settler colonialism as the lens, right? So settler colonialism and indigenous epistemologies as really the dual lenses for the ways that we look at environmental justice as it relates to Native people. And so for those of us who are familiar with this concept of settler colonialism, we can trace it back to its most recognizable or kind of foundational theorist that talked about it was Patrick Wolfe. And he started really talking about it, to my knowledge, about 1999. And then he wrote this essay in 2016 that was called Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native. And it's really foundational to this work. And in that, he says that basically settler colonialism is a system that is about the elimination of the native. And it's for the purpose of replacing indigenous populations with settler populations. So it's always about land. And the acquisition of land by invading populations. And so turning to the work of Kyle White, who maybe some of you have read if you're doing work on indigenous environmental issues and topics, you've probably come across Kyle White's work because he's so prolific on these topics related to environmentalism, environmental justice, climate change, all of these. He's got so much work, and his work is so foundational to indigenous studies. And so I'm recommending right now that if you aren't familiar with him, that you do familiarize yourself with his work, because it's been super informative to my work. And so I'm referring to him because it's been so important to it. And there's this particular piece of it where he says that settler colonialism, when applied to this concept of environmental justice, is that in that context is that it's the disruption of systems of responsibility between humans and the non-human world and the land to which they belong. And this goes back to a concept that we teach a lot about, like where I work. It's not exclusive to to our department or where I am at Cal State San Marcos. It's really an increasingly broad way of understanding indigenous epistemologies that we call the 4 R's. And it begins with relationality, that is seeing the world in terms of relationships, reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. So this is something that's really useful, again, also for you to refer back to. And then the thing about settler colonialism is that it denies what it's done and it describes it as progress. And the most obvious example is, as this famous painting here, Columbia, this is Columbia, that was so illustrative of really what the American project was all about. It was about this, this spreading of education and enlightenment from the east to the west, and bringing light to darkness. And it's Indians who represent the darkness as they're fleeing from their savage, ways, as civilization is being brought forward to them through education, because she holds this book in her hand. And we can imagine that's what kind of book it is, but it could easily be a Bible, for example. So Western expansion is really understood as progress, and the Industrial Revolution too is the triumph of technology over nature, really. So for Native peoples, though, what it is it's a totally different thing. While settler populations were conquering nature, while they were bringing, the enlightenment of technology and education to the land, and really domination. For Native peoples, it's really just a process of massive destruction. It's destruction of the environment, it's destruction of culture, it's destruction of ways of life, of language, of religion, of all of these things. And that includes, and I always need to say this, is that it includes slavery, because this is a topic that's so often overlooked when we talk about the history of settler colonialism. And relative to environmental injustice. So if settler colonialism is a process of environmental injustice, and that is explicitly what we're saying, this history of slavery has everything to do with it, because it's 400 years long. It doesn't even end until the turn of the 20th century, well into the American period, and well after the Emancipation Proclamation gives freedom to chattel slavery and African descended people. So we always have to keep that in mind. That's not that long ago, especially for us as Native people. So Western expansion and the Industrial Revolution is, again, this process of dispossession, and it creates a system that is what we can call structural genocide, and that's how Wolf actually refers to it in that 2006 essay. So structural genocide is what we're left with in this system of settler colonialism. And then one of the examples of that, of how Western expansion and the Industrial Revolution does this, is through the building of railroads and dams. And I look at this in the book because it's we're very used to hearing historical narratives about railroads, and and associate them. We do associate them with environmental destruction, especially around the extinction of the buffalo, because it was the railroads that make that possible during the late 19th century as a technology of genocide, right? So it's about extinction, bringing on the extinction of the buffalo in order to starve indigenous populations into submission. And that's what happened. So this is really a key and central part of Western expansion as this process of environmental injustice. And then dams are something that's really, it's a huge part of it, but it really hasn't been written about much in this way. Although I think that we're beginning to see it. I write about it in my book, and it's largely because I come from a people who were deeply impacted by a dam on our reservation. We were impacted by the building of the Grand Coulee Dam, which drowned our ancient salmon fisheries. And so this is something that I grew up with. And then also, I want to point to the work of Nick Estes in his recent book that came out this year, Our History is the Future, about the Lakota resistance to colonization, as he tells it, through the story of Standing Rock. So he does a really good job about highlighting the way dams were also this profoundly destructive process on the plains. So we're talking about, you know, what environmental injustice is in these really broad, sweeping strokes. But then how do we talk about what environmental justice, on the other hand, is? And so this definition is taken from, it's a legal definition that was initially articulated in an executive order in the Clinton administration. So it was Executive Order 13175. I think that's, 12898. I think that's the one. I've been doing a lot of researching on executive orders the last couple of days, so they're getting kind of meshing in my brain. But it's the executive order on environmental justice that was implemented by Clinton in 1992 and begins this sort of language that we have now to talk about environmental justice. And it says that environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So this is something the federal government and state governments as well have adopted this particular definition. Here in California, that certainly is the case. And on its surface, it seems reasonable. It seems to be pretty broad, all-encompassing way of understanding what environmental justice is. And if we look at the literature, it hinges on this concept of environmental racism. So environmental racism is a concept that was first brought forth in the 1980s, because we don't really have a language for environmental justice really until the 1980s. So it's pretty recent. And it began in the South with what was suspected to be intentional polluting of Black communities, which they said was a deliberately racist act. And so there were studies that were done. There were community-based studies, and then it branched out into government studies to understand if it was really true that it was this intentionally racist act that was disproportionately targeting Black communities for these toxic facilities. And it turns out the evidence pointed to that, that seemed to be the case, that this this thing of environmental racism was really happening. Okay, so what does it mean? What do we mean when we're talking about environmental racism? These are the questions that I was asking with my study, because the way that I'm looking at it is that if we limit it to environmental racism and the disproportionate of citing of noxious facilities, for example, as the criteria, it doesn't really address Native people and their very, very different circumstances. So here, we need to make some pretty important distinctions that begin with the fact that Native peoples are not a race or an ethnic group, but they're tribes and nations. They're people with political relationships to the state. not an ethnic minority group. These are well documented and well established in law. So we need to start at that point. And understand that the concept of racism is really, it's not enough to understand Native Americans' concerns around environmental injustice, because of that political distinction, as well as the history of colonization. So Native people are the only people in the US who have of this history of colonization and based on genocide, basically. And again, these political relationships, which we talk about in terms of government to government relationships. And then also in this that are not based on Eurocentric worldviews. So this is a really important piece of this. So, so another one of these important assumptions is that colonization really comes, what it means for Native people in practical terms is that it's a relationship of domination. Despite the fact that we talk about this political relationship to the state, it's a political relationship that's been constructed based on some really egregious and problematic foundations in federal Indian law, which we can name explicitly as the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of domestic dependent nations, the plenary power doctrine, and we could even argue that the trust responsibility is part of that. But it's really problematic because at the same time, it's also a legal concept that we rely on for any kind of justice at all. So that's a big conversation. But also part of that, this history of colonization is that it's based on white supremacy. So even though, so I'm not saying that, Native people don't experience racism. It's not that, because clearly it does involve racism, especially if we talk about white supremacy as the kind of framework for the way that federal Indian law has inferiorized Native peoples. But it begins not as a process of racial hatred or racial discrimination, but it begins as a process of religious and cultural superiority. So it's really a process of settler privilege. This is how I'm thinking about it and writing about it these days. So it's not just white privilege, it's settler privilege. And so we have to be able to understand it in these terms. And so conversely, when we talk about decolonization or environmental justice as a process of decolonization, we need to challenge the ways that this structural injustice has resulted in this power imbalance for Native people on their own homeland. So we have to be able to talk about this. Okay, so settler privilege and white supremacy and environmentalism. This is a huge theme in my work in the book, as you read in that chapter. And so I want to kind of go over some of those main points of that. And it begins with the language that we have in this country about environmentalism begins with the conservation and preservation movement, or what we call proto-environmentalism. And its foundation is in the pristine wilderness myth, also what we call the virgin wilderness myth that's known as various things. This is how we recognize, white Europeans came here to a vast open uninhabited wilderness, and it was theirs for the taking. And why? Because even the people that did happen to be there, they weren't using the land in correct ways. And correct, of course, is always based on European notions of land improvement, European techniques of farming, of built environments, these kinds of things. And also is that part of this myth is that Native people, not only did they not use these kinds of land improvement techniques, they didn't even alter their environments at all. And that's what makes them savage, or that's part of what makes them savage heathens, that then legitimizes the taking of land over the centuries. And we even see it in the writings of Thoreau. And it's really important to point this out because Thoreau, even Ralph Waldo Emerson, before him, or who was one of his contemporaries actually, and then later John Muir, these people that we think of as some of the like godfathers of the environmental movement, who are so lauded and heralded as these heroes in the environmental movement. Thoreau really, he's written about as this person who is an Indianist. That was the language that they would use in the 19th century. He was an Indianist. He was thought to be, very pro-Indian. He was an abolitionist. He was, he's not a bad guy. He's fighting for the right things, but he's a man of his times in that he fetishizes Indians in these pretty weird ways, but ways that were really common at the time. And what he appreciates about them is that Native people, they know how to live in the wilderness and be in harmony with nature, and all these kinds of tropes. But ultimately, he was a social Darwinist in that he believed that Native people ultimately were going to pass away, into the mists of time due to superior European civilization. So he's upholding this indigenous inferiority and savage Native trope that's being built into federal Indian law and policy throughout the 19th century. So this is all happening, and we have the national parks movement, as you hopefully wrote about in that chapter. An important piece of this is the writing of Mark David Spence, whose work, Dispossessing the Wilderness, is so important here. Where his really salient point is that the founding of the national park system was about the concept of wilderness. It was about revering this emerging concept of wilderness, and wilderness always, of course, is about the absence of humans, and he says that wilderness had to first be created. And so what that meant, and of course this is happening during the period of the Indian Wars, when the cavalry was out on the plains rounding up resistant Indians who weren't interested in settling on reservations and giving up their lifestyles. So all of that's happening at the same time. And so it leads to, Indians being forcibly removed from those first national parks, especially in Yellowstone, Glacier National Park, and Yosemite here in California. So it's again this cultural production of wilderness. That's a European conception of land without people that has to be created, and it has to be adhered to in this manufactured way. And then the Sierra Club is a huge part of that, and this happens in 1892. John Muir has been traipsing around the Sierras and writing in his journals, and having his epiphanies with nature, and at the same time, he's writing all kinds of really horrible things about California Indians, who he despises. He's not even just mildly racist. He thinks these are vile human beings. And so he really, is coming at this from this, very this white supremacist way that's such a already an integral, deep part of American identity, American consciousness. And so this all gets encoded into this proto-environmental movement. And then it builds through the 20th century. In the chapter I write about, the early 20th century, it's the closing of the frontier has everything to do with this, and this kind of anxiety, this growing anxiety about modernity and how cities and urbanization is leading to anxiety about, increasingly polluted spaces and the closing of wilderness spaces. So all of this stuff is playing into it, and it becomes about how do Americans manage the land that's left, as there's this human encroachment into these, quote unquote wilderness spaces. And so by the 1960s, we have what we call second wave environmentalism. And what we can define as the newest noble savage, right? Because during the late 19th century, we see the birth of or we could say the transition of natives as savages. In the late 19th century, natives as the savage Indians kind of changes into the noble savage. And the noble savage is noble because he's no longer a threat to American society because he's been contained, right? Natives are now militarily defeated. They are safely contained on reservations. Their populations are dying. We don't have to worry about them anymore. We have to figure out what to do with the ones that are left because they're vanishing anyway. So this is what's happening. And throughout the 20th century, things start changing, and Native people are, there's still a problem. It's still the Indian problem. But we see the noble savage become the ecological Indian, as I've written about it in that chapter. And so the ecological Indian is it emerges it coincides with what's happening and with the birth of this environmental movement. So we know that Rachel Carson writes her book Silent Spring in 1961. It gets all this attention, DDT is killing eagles, it's harming the environment. And then in 1969, the Santa Barbara oil spill happens. The Cuyahoga River catches on fire. And it's like, people are becoming increasingly aware of this, incredibly polluted environment that is taking shape. President Nixon, is for all the bad things that guy did, he did sign the Environmental Protection Act in 1970, instituted the Environmental Protection Agency. And so we have this new language of environmentalism, and that coincides with this youth movement that's happening. So the counterculture is being born. It emerges out of the Beat generation and this bohemianism that's so popular, so defining popular culture at the time. And so people are looking to Indians because it's also coinciding with ethnic nationalist movements that are going on. The civil rights movement, Native people are fighting against a policy called termination. They are trying to hold on to their cultures, like always trying to hold on to their cultures and their land. And the termination policy has been defining Native life since the 1950s. And so So we see the Alcatraz Island occupation. Oh, and before that, the fish wars, so-called fish wars in the Pacific Northwest began in 1964, and that it lasts for like 10 years. Alcatraz Island occupation happens from 1969 to 71. These are expressly environmental. They're Indian rights movements, but they always involve land. And then this kind of moment happens in 1971 with the Crying Indian commercial. And now I want to ask to see how many people in the room have ever seen the Crying Indian commercial or know what it is. I can't tell who's raising their hands. How many people have not seen it? How many hands are raised? Okay, because I want to show this. I show this to all my classes because the students that I teach are, by and large, they're pretty young and they've never seen it. And so when I show it to them, it blows their mind. So I'm gonna okay, get out of here for just a second. Okay.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
So the Keep America Beautiful campaign. Okay, let me go back to my PowerPoint here. So I'm old enough to have been, to live through that. I was a teenager, okay, when this thing came out. I was just turned into my teenage years. And again, keep in mind that this thing came out while Indians are on Alcatraz Island, like fighting for survival, basically. And it's, national news. I mean, Indians are on the national evening news for the first time, like ever. Like people are like, wow, the Indians are still around. I had no idea. And not only that, but they're really pissed off and they want their rights. And then this commercial comes out, which is totally, appealing to that ecological Indian, right? The Indian is now the ecological standard bearer for the environmental movement, and so it's this moment in time that it's like a defining moment, and it just sticks. Also, I want to point out to you, there's more, this link right here, more background on the ecological Indian. I just did this last week. It was a radio show on NPR. Oh, let me go back to that screen. It's a Radio Lab production on the history of the Keep America Beautiful campaign. And I want to encourage you to look at it. It's called The Litter Myth. And so it's this look at the history of the Keep America Beautiful campaign and how it basically represents this the Keep America Beautiful campaign was about making trash and pollution and environmental problems individual concerns, and basically totally absolved the corporate world for accountability and responsibility. And so this radio show talks about that history. It's really a fascinating history. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, so this is all really important for understanding the environmental movement and how the relationship to the environment, to Indian country, just starts off. It just goes off in such a bad way. Even though it was not intentional. It just, America were so indoctrinated with these stereotypes and misconceptions because of the white supremacy at the root of all this, that it just led to, problems with the movement not supporting Native people in the ways that they should have and needed to, but didn't. So this is what the point of all this is, and the way that I've written about it. They were, American society and white supremacy has always been about wanting the Indian on their own terms, and not in ways that were real. And so this lasts until the 1990s. We see the Sierra Club, we see other environmental organizations habitually working against Indian country and their projects to get land back, their projects to use land. The Native people as the original environmentalists are upheld, in ways that are not realistic, because what's also happening at the same time is that we're finally getting some legal strength to develop our lands, to get out of poverty, right? Because Indians are the most poor people in the country. And the only escape out of poverty, for the most part, is to develop their lands, which, oh, by the way, have got some pretty amazing resources on them, and valuable resources like uranium, like timber, like gold, and other kinds of minerals that are pretty coveted by Western society. So for Indians, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. You can never live up to this standard that's been set for them. Okay, so this is all happening during the Red Power movement. This is how we describe it. Okay, so now I'll kind of switch gears, and now that I've sort of laid a foundation about how the environmental movement has been so problematic with Indian country, and led to the inability to work with Indian country in these ways that have left this legacy. My argument is that it really hasn't really. It's changed. I will say that it's changed. We see more solidarity. Standing Rock was a really good example of that. The Idle No More movement before that was another good example of how these social movements started by Indigenous people galvanize global attention and support. So this is definitely happening, but there are vestiges of the legacy of this is infiltrating these movements in really problematic ways, that, as I wrote about in that chapter, how it showed up in Standing Rock in this gendered way among the women. I have a whole chapter about that follows the chapter that you had read about the environmental movement, and its problematic relationship with Indian country. So I've been present to. I consider myself a scholar, a writer, a journalist, but also an activist. And I really began as an activist. And so there's the lines really are pretty blurry in these definitions for me, and it's also related to some of the other scholarship that I do is in sports studies. Kay, I live at the beach. I grew up in Southern California. I live at the ocean. I grew up riding waves. So I'm a surfer. And so all of these things come together for me personally. And even though they seem like really disparate kinds of activities or realms of life, they come together for me. And I'm always trying to make them explicit and relate to each other, like connect the dots. Like for me, that's part of my own indigenous epistemology is like the relationality of all of that. So this is how I keep thinking about all of it. So the reason I'm saying that is that some of the activism that I've been drawn to in the last few years is around environmentalism, around ocean activism, which inevitably involves surfers and the surfing community, which is massive, especially here in California. So so I'm often like the sole like native person that shows up to these spaces, and here I am talking about settler colonialism as the driving force for surf culture. And you can't talk about surfing without talking about indigenous land dispossession and all these things that drive surfers crazy. so I'm the one, I call myself the indigenous, no, the buzz kill. Like I'm out there killing everybody's stoked. Talking about surfing and settler colonialism and genocide, right? Nobody wants to talk about that. So anyway, all these things that seem weird, but they all do come together in logical ways. So my general approach when I'm working with different kinds of communities, so I work with surf communities, environmental communities, also work with educators. I get invited into these really different spaces. And recently I've been invited into, I don't know how this happened, but I've been invited into spaces of faith communities. Like evangelical Christians are inviting me to come in and talk to them about environmental justice. Like I didn't see that one coming at all. Nevertheless, it's happening. And so I'm increasingly going out into these really broad spaces of like non-native spaces to talk about these really provocative, difficult topics. But they're asking for it. So, I'm not going to varnish it for them and try to make them feel better. It's, we need to talk about white privilege. We need to talk about settler privilege. And genocide and all these topics. And so my general approach is threefold when I'm doing this work. I first of all work on what I have called unerasing Indigenous peoples. And this is really when I started going into these surfer environmentalist spaces, this is how I was approaching it, because in California, the Indigenous erasure is profound. I mean, it's hard. You can't overstate it. You can't overstate the fact that here in coastal Southern California, nobody wants to talk about the fact that Indigenous peoples have been here for tens of thousands of years, and that the only reason that you can be here is because of the genocide that happened here. So that's the first step. The first step is unerasing Indigenous peoples, and then demanding accountability of settler society. So accountability, and then talking about ethical relationships to land and place. So let's go into it a little bit further. So in my work of unerasing Indigenous peoples, the points of stress are nationhood, and it always needs to be whenever you're talking about decolonization and environmental justice. You start with Indigenous peoples as nations. That is treaty based and legally based on the trust responsibility. The federal government has this relationship that's been affirmed over and over and over again in federal Indian law, that they have a fiduciary responsibility to Native peoples as the owners of title, because for those of you who don't know, Native people do not even own the titles to their own land. Okay, this is part of structural settler colonialism and structural genocide. Is Native peoples are not considered owners of their own land. The federal government owns the land in trust, this trust relationship. Okay, then the difference between federally recognized tribes and unrecognized tribes. This is a huge issue, especially here in California, because the processes of genocide were so extreme that you had hundreds of tribes in the state, tribal nations who were completely dispossessed, almost completely dispossessed. And so you have nations here who are still nations, but they don't enjoy federal recognition. So they don't have the legal protections of federal Indian law like other tribes do. So it makes it really tough to, especially in these coastal areas that are subject to relentless development. These are huge problems. The erasure, the disappearance of native sacred sites, for example, where I live in Orange County, has been almost complete. So it's been estimated that only about 10% of native sacred sites even still exist where I live. So this is what we're fighting like constantly in this area. And the unfederally recognized tribes have very little power over this. So it's a constant a traumatization, like the reenacting of trauma all over and over and over again for them. So let's see. So I just touched on that. So trust lands, this is how we talk about reservations. This is a matter of sovereignty for the federally recognized tribes, and sacred sites are thus a matter of sovereignty. So they do have some legal power over them. But you still have a lot of sacred sites, even for federally recognized tribes, that are unceded lands, lands that were not given away, but were taken illegally, such as the Standing Rock conflict illustrated. That was a huge part of what was going on. You know, the digging up of burials on the unceded sites was a huge problem. It wasn't just about the water. And so for the unrecognized tribes, so for sacred sites on unceded lands outside reservation boundaries, and for unfederally recognized tribes, land issues are environmental justice issues. These are the arguments that I'm making. So for that second point of accountability, how we talk about holding settler society accountable, just some really again, broad ways of talking about it is how we understand history and how we frame it. It's important to be explicit about genocide, that it's not about wrongdoing or mistreatment. This is the language that the federal government and state governments resort to. For example, in the apology resolution that was handed down in 2007, the language that was used was that, you know, we apologize for, you know, periods of mistreatment and wrongdoing that the U.S. has done. And even in this we had a recent one here in California a month ago. The governor of the state issued an executive order as an official apology, but he gave this talk. When he gave the talk to the media, he actually used the word genocide in that speech, apologizing for genocide, which was huge that happened. But when you look at the language of the executive order, the word genocide is not used in there. It resorts to this language of wrongdoing and mistreatment. So So we have to hold them accountable to the history as it actually happened. We have to be able to talk about settler colonialism as a structure of power. So it's not something that just happened in the future. It's something that crystallized into the structural imbalance of power that we're bound by, that's inherently genocidal because it continually seeks to, its impulse to eliminate Native peoples from their homelands. So even while you have, so it's paradoxical because you have the federal government at times giving land back or settling land claims. Just this year, we had the federal government actually gave 32,000 acres of public lands were returned in Oregon to the lower Umpqua people and some other tribes that are related. So even though that does happen, at the same time, we also had in the last year the Mashpee in Massachusetts, their trust status lands were reversed. So we have both things going on in this system, system of systemic power imbalance. And again, the legal system, the legal doctrines that maintain this relationship of domination needs to be called out. We have to be talking about it. And sometimes I just recently started talking about this as what we call the colonial unspeakable. The things that, the ways that this structure is inherently genocidal has rendered it unspeakable, or even giving land back, right? That how do you reverse that? By giving land back, for example, is also something that's unspeakable. Like, oh my God, we can't give the land back to the Indians. Like, that's just not possible, right? You need to get over the history and deal with it. Like, we hear that a lot. And then naming white supremacy. We have to be able to call out white supremacy like we see. We have a national dialogue about it now, to some degree, since the Trump administration has exposed all this white nationalism that is really defining our current political moment. But while we name white supremacy, we also have to constantly make these distinctions and emphasize the political difference of Native peoples as nations, not a race. Right? So we have to keep saying that. It's about settler privilege, not just racial privilege. And then finally, how we talk about ethical relationships to land. I've been doing this in my teaching a lot. I started teaching a class on traditional ecological knowledge, and my agenda for that class is to instill. So I'm teaching, we're talking about traditional ecological knowledge, like traditional indigenous knowledge, and what it is and what it's based on. And that's all about epistemology and philosophy and religion and spirituality, right? You can't talk about indigenous knowledge without engaging those topics. And so my goal is to help shape the consciousness of settler students, like non-Native students, and get them to think more deeply about their own personal relationship to land and place and where they come from, and the indigenous people of that place. Because my philosophy, if we're talking about paradigm shift, because that's ultimately the goal, we want to shift paradigms and create transformation, social transformation, for the goal of structural change, right? So we're talking about structural change, which is about change at the systemic level, which we might talk about a top-down, which can be a top-down approach, but it also has to be a bottom-up approach through movements, so through social movements. And so you don't have structural systemic change without changing consciousness on the individual level. That's the way I'm thinking about it. So, so all of these things are tied together, and if we're working with non-native people, we have to be able to have these conversations, and it's part of building our relationships, a part of building alliances with communities that we need to work with. That's the goal, and overcome the antagonism that so often defines these activist spaces. And so, we can teach Indigenous knowledge and impart Indigenous knowledge in ways that doesn't encourage appropriation, right? So that's a huge point to all of this. So yeah, how can we, since we all have to live together, right? We're all fighting some of the same enemies now, corporate fossil fuels, fascism, green capitalism even. We have to be able to build collective alliances and be empowered together. So that's how I'm thinking about these things. And this is the conclusion of my PowerPoint. And I wanted to leave you with these thoughts, maybe some things to talk about in your next session. And that concludes this talk.
Do we have time for questions?
Ina, is it okay if I make you big on the screen again, or maybe you?
Yeah, let me, I think I can do it from this end. Let me get rid of my PowerPoint. Is that good?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Questions, folks?
Yeah,
Question? You might have to speak up.
Yeah.
Dominique, you might have to stand up just so
Okay.
people can hear you and stuff.
I'm on the other side, and the mic is on that camera. So.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Why you share the same tribe with my daughter, so. All right,
Oh.
I'm looking at you. So that was exciting to see that connection with Kabul tribes, and also I was really excited to find your writing. I've been asked through a postdoc to co-teach an environmental conservation class that's been taught for years from the narrative of the godfathers of conservation that you referenced. So I've had 2 classes so far. It's 150 students. They're probably maybe 80–90% white students. And so it's been really interesting giving them this historical context. I'm giving them your chapter as a homework assignment also this week. And I think it's really well written, so I'm grateful for your work. And so based on the first lecture though, where I gave them this broader historical context, the main responses, I asked for some feedback from them at the end. The main responses is they were disappointed that they hadn't been taught this history, which I thought was good. And then the other one I get a lot is these are mostly freshmen right out of high school. I get a lot of the white students that say, well, what can I do? What can I do? I want to do something now about it. So I just wanted to see what you thought in terms of responding to that. Thank you.
Yeah, these are the same responses I get too in my classes and in the spaces where I teach. I think I get a lot of outrage sometimes too. People are, these 19-year-old, 20-year-olds, 20-somethings come into these rooms and they are faced with histories that they've never heard before, and they're pissed, and they should be, because they've been lied to, they've been miseducated like all of us, because of the Western education system is not designed to create critical thinkers. It's designed to make obedient citizens, obedient patriotic citizens, and it just doesn't mesh to teach them the injustices of American history and the way this country was actually founded. So, you know, I don't know that there's a magic bullet answer for that, other than to encourage them to keep educating themselves, to keep learning, to keep reading, and to learn about the indigenous peoples where they live. That's part of what I do in my TEK classes. They have to learn about the indigenous peoples where they live. And so that particular class it's a community-based education methodology. And so we take them out onto the land. We take them on field trips 4 times during the semester. We go to we happen to live where our school is in northern San Diego County, happens to have the highest concentration of Indian reservations per county in the country, even though they're really small. It's a really good opportunity to take them out onto the land, and the communities are always happy to have us to educate these students in this way. And so you know, it's just about continuing to raise their awareness and giving them the tools that they need to do that, and you know, develop a critical consciousness, but also develop awareness of the particular areas where they're at. One of the exercises that I do with them is at the beginning of the class session of the semester, I ask them, what is your relationship to land and place? You know, how would you describe your relationship to the place that you call home, whatever it is? How do you define it? And who are the indigenous peoples of that land, and what do you know about them? And invariably they know nothing. And you know, they pretty much say, well, you know, my relationship to home is about the house I grew up in. It's about the neighborhood I live in. It's about, you know, the stores I go to. You know, it's really shallow stuff. It's predictable. And then I ask them that at the end of the course. I have them write about it at the end of the course partly for my own selfish reasons. I want to see if what they've learned over the course of the semester has changed their consciousness at all. And so far it seems to. I'm in my second semester teaching this course. And so I'm gathering, it's field work for me. So I'm gathering information, but that's how I do it.
Thank you.
Lemlem.
Other folks?
I got
So we've got 2.
Can I stand here and ask? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Yate, my name is Marie.
Yate.
From Diné country. In terms of what you were talking about, my experience in my own community, you know, to even begin to do any kind of work with my community to address some of the issues that we've got outstanding, it feels like we're stuck in our own trauma, I call it. There's a need, it seems like there's a need for us to learn our own history as well. Because, you know, on Navajo, I just found that through my life, like you said, like just how white students haven't been taught the history, as indigenous peoples, we haven't been taught the history either.
Yeah.
And I've just shared with folks here, I went to Canada to study, and that's where I learned all about the American Indian policies that took place, and I was totally ignorant of this. But in saying that, I found that when I had been enlightened somewhat about my own history, as you know, the first kind of responses you have anger, rage at like what happened, but again, that can be very overwhelming, especially if you're not near your community to have that support. But in my own mind, you know, it was so overwhelming. I had to say to myself, how can I turn this rage and this anger into something that can be useful to my own people, meaning that my knowledge that I had gained, you know, how can I turn it into a positive rather than feeling really awful about it and actually probably get really depressed and everything, like there's not a sense of hope. But in coming home to my own territories, I found, like in my own community, that was greatly lacking, the education of our own history, the recent history of the relocation that happened in the Navajo communities. Our own people don't even know that history.
Yeah.
So it feels like we're all in need of education, you know, to have this dialogue. Because sometimes, you know, like in my community, for the most part, like especially at our tribal government level, nobody's using the word decolonizing. Nobody's using the word oppression, you know. But anyway, I just wanted to see, like, do you find this in the among like Indigenous peoples that we also have a need to learn our own history so that we can really have dialogue with the settler community as well?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. You know, the kinds of conversations that we're having right now are conversations that really are born out of activist spaces, but also out of educational spaces, out of, you know, especially Indigenous studies and Native American studies. But you know, more and more it's happening. I mean, I think that we have a long way to go, but I think that it's changed a lot over the last half century. And I think, you know, when I look at, you know, Standing Rock, for example, as a social movement, it was global. It had global reach, and it changed a lot of people. I mean, we even hear Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, right? She became politicized to these issues because she went to Standing Rock, right? So she was a water protector. She is now in Congress, so she can speak that language. She, you know, helped author this Green New Deal. So we have a national conversation. And it's going to keep infiltrating, you know, even our native communities. And, you know, I think, I mean, it's tough, especially on the reservation communities. There needs to be definitely Native studies courses. They need to get this language of colonization. But I mean, even tribal councils don't have this language. They don't talk about decolonizations, you know, very much, if at all. You know, but we also have to understand that today's tribal governments are basically they function as not much more or not much less than administrative wings of the federal government, right? So again, we have to be able to speak truth to that. And they're just fighting to keep alive. They're fighting for the funds that keep their programs going, that keep their houses built, that keep their, you know, tribal governments running. So, you know, but at the same time, I think that, you know, as the more that we put this language out there and keep talking in these ways, they are getting it. Maybe not fast enough for me, but I think that, you know, that's our responsibility as scholars and activists, is just to keep putting it out there. I mean, hey, you look at what happened in Navajo with it was activism that stopped the Desert Rock coal fire power plant from happening, right? So there are lots of examples that we can point to on reservation communities where activism stopped bad things from happening. So you know, we have to look for those positive examples too, for our hope.
Hi, so I hear you talking a lot about educating like the college student, right? But I'm actually interested in what your thoughts are about bringing this conversation into like grade schools on reservations. We do have res schools, we do have a lot of these communities. And what are your thoughts about educating younger children in sort of along that trend up to 12th grade?
I think you got to have good materials to teach from. You have to have willing teachers. I don't really work with that population very much, you know, I have to be honest about that. But you know, I do get these questions frequently, and I do work with educators. Mostly they're not educators in reservation communities, but I know that they're always asking for material. Like, you know, what can you recommend for material that we can teach from? I would suggest, off the top of my head, Roxanne's book, An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. Do you know that book?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so it was just released as a young adults edition. Yeah, I think that's a really important one. So, and then also look at, I don't know if you know Debbie Reese's work and Jean Mendoza, their website, American Indian Children's Literature. I would become really familiar with that one. They do an amazing job screening out all the crap books on, you know, Indians for kids, you know, Indian books for kids. They are the experts on that. So, so definitely, you know, plug into that. Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Hello, my name's Ariel. I'm from Coach de Pueblo, which is one of the tribes in New Mexico. I don't really have a good question. I guess I just really had more of a comment, and that was just to say thank you so much for your just thought processes, because I feel like, you know, I identify myself still as a youth. I'm still really learning more about this world, what decolonizing means, what that means for me as an individual and for my community. And I recognize that there's issues, and I don't know what's the best way to communicate that all the time. And after just reading one chapter from your book, it felt so inspiring to know, like, oh, this is what I wanted to tell people, and I didn't know how to say it at the time. And now I feel like I have real good examples of how to explain to people why the word conservation doesn't always connect to me, and why the environmental movement wasn't meant for Native people in the beginning, and why I don't agree with creating a national park next to our reservation, and how wilderness doesn't protect me or doesn't protect sacred sites for my people. And all of these issues are happening right now, and it just feels really empowering to know that there's words I can use now to really try to educate people about why these things bother me as an Indigenous person, and why they don't benefit us at this moment in time. And I just really wanted to thank you so much for just even that single chapter. And I was like, oh my God, I need to read this whole book, because I feel like it'll help me so much and be another tool and resource for me to use in the future.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And hey, well, do you live in Colorado, or do you live at Cochiti?
I live in New Mexico, yeah.
You do. I would really recommend for you and anybody else in the room, in fact, are you familiar with the Red Nation?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, they had their Native Liberation Conference this weekend, and that was what I was referring to. I was giving a plenary talk where they were in Gallup. I would really encourage you to plug into that network. because you will find like-minded people there, people at the University of New Mexico. I went to school in New Mexico at UNM, so I did all of my undergrad and graduate work there, and it's such a rich and powerful place for this knowledge. Some of the most amazing work being done right now in American Indian activism and scholarship is coming out of the University of New Mexico. So, so I would really encourage you to plug into it. They've got an office even. Nick Estes is a friend of mine, and Melanie, his wife, and so I'm familiar with many of those people, and they're doing a really badass work. So I would really encourage you to connect with them.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for all of your work.
Thank you.
Dina, I want to thank you so much again for joining us virtually. I think we only have a few hours left together in our conference, so we need to probably move on and let people have their lunch. I guess I have one question is, I see that I don't know if we did this intentionally or unintentionally, but it looks like this conversation was recorded. I see it on the screen, so what we can discuss later what you would like us to do with that. One participant had asked earlier about having students be able to see it in her class, so I don't want to put you on the spot to answer right this minute.
Oh, no, that makes me happy. I'm glad for that, actually. Yeah. Okay. In fact, I would like to be able to have access to the recording too.
Okay, we'll find out how to. We'll find out. Make sure that we don't accidentally delete it when we log off. But again, thank you so much. Really, your chapter and your talk really hit the mark and added a lot. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm gonna log off now and say goodbye. Thanks for having me.
You have a standing ovation, just so you know. Yeah. Standing ovation. Standing ovation.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
So it's time to eat.
Let me get this book real quick.
I'm leaving this open. Days of mourning. We're going to start.
Yeah. It's a lot.
It's still running up there. We just want to make sure that it's safe the recording and then there's a way to send me the link. Yeah. I'm gonna get her book. Oh yeah, she was great. I loved her. She knew. Loved her. Just got my books. I loved her way, you know. Great. We got some magic flow. Well, that's great. I remember. I didn't know about it. I thought you all were. But you were very, you know, we just said, and we did have a, and then we did have a straw and like, you know, about us personally and about here. And, you know, I shared with her kind of what I had learned from growing with the local both of you about the conversation about the land and what's their perspective. Yeah, no, that's what, well, yeah. I'm conserving the spoon. Yeah. I said I was gonna not take a spoon. No, I just wasn't gonna use it. Yeah. Yeah.